You murdered this man.
Yes.
You tortured him.
Of course.
If you had that moment to live over again.
I'd have kept him alive a week.
But you would have still tortured him and killed him.
Oh, I'd have tortured him for a week, yeah, instead of 3 days. Definitely.
Do you believe him? Do you think he really was a snitch?
Oops, if he wasn't.
Are you remorseful?
Not at all.
Why?
Why would I be? What's the difference? Everybody has a reason to kill.
There's a level of violence and sadism to the crime, and the level of overkill, the level of torture that this victim...
Hey. Yeah. How much of what I tell you will you tell to put in the paper? My children read the paper.
I'm not going to put anything in the paper.
Nothing about confession, nothing like that, because I just don't want my children to see something that's...
I can understand that.
She's trying to do image management. She's going to look really cold, like a hardened person who can kill people. So she is concerned with how she's going to be viewed. There's a narcissistic element to psychopathy, and there's the control element, to be in charge. And she's doing both of those things.
Wow. I killed Terry.
Tell me how and why.
I killed Terry by deceptively luring him into apartment 201, sitting him down and beating him with various objects until he was unconscious, and then I slit his throat.
Simpson is confessing to a brutal murder, and it's as if she couldn't be bothered with anything in the world. She's sitting there having a snack, taking a sip of her soda as she's admitting to it. She has a very flat affect. She's not showing changes in the tone of her voice or her facial expressions. She's saying it as if she's telling you what she ate for breakfast that day.
I told him upstairs, when I do give you some when I do, because that's what he kept asking me to do, would you please? Oh, yeah.
Is that what he thought he was going to get?
Exactly. That's why I deceptively lured him up there.
Then you walked up the stairs with you?
Yeah.
Thought he was going to get a little something.
Yep. Shady.
That ability to change who they are, to change how they approach you, how they present, how they look. That chameleon skill is very much a marker of the type of psychopath that navigates different environments. They're able to lure victims in by studying them, learning what it is that's going to be the hook for that individual. She likely would have been more flirtatious, more cunning, which is what allowed him to trust her and go with her. And that is not likely the person we're seeing in any of these interviews.
Why?
Why? Because Terry told me that he was an informant.
Okay.
That's it.
Who was he working for?
He said that he met with the DA periodically, still, regarding cases that are, I don't know, 10 to 16 years old. Crazy.
There's no evidence that the victim ever was an informant. Simpson sees herself as some kind of a vigilante. It's her job to decide who lives and who dies.
She is firmly convinced that her view is the reality and justifies her action. With psychopaths, once they've made up their minds, there's this narcissistic approach, like, I know it all, I know what I'm doing, I don't second guess myself because I'm right. They've decided they know what they're doing. So she was a little more impulsive in that way.
And I asked him about the snitching, and did you really do these things? Did you say these things? Did you go to court for? Are you still going to court for? There's how many other that you're going to snitch on that you're planning on? And he told me everything, and I proceeded to beat him to death.
With the tire iron?
Tire iron, a stick, a hammer. Yes, I did have my hammer.
Okay, there were other things that were done to you.
Yes, there were.
Tell me about that.
About what?
The other things, because obviously
The breaking and cutting up of Terry the Sitch.
Yes.
Yes.
Tell me about that. Was he screaming or what?
Yes, he was quite loud.
What was he saying?
Helen.
Helen?
Exactly.
What's up with that?
Just pissed me off a little bit more.
Didn't he know your name?
Helen, why are you so mad at me?
Simpson seems to think of herself as on a different level than other people, such that she believes this person is so wrong for being a snitch. She acted on something that she had little basis for knowing. She thought this person was a snitch. It didn't end up being true. She still has no remorse for it. And she was so extreme in what she did to this person.
So how long did the beating take place?
How long?
Yeah.
I swear to God, I cannot tell you that. From the way I felt the next day, probably at least an hour. Before he was unconscious, I had taken a mirror from the other bedroom into the bedroom with him where he was at and shown him. I wiped up his eyes so he could see he's bleeding extensively. And I had him look at himself for a couple of minutes.
Why'd you do that?
Because I wanted him to see what it was that he was.
And what is that?
A traitor.
Because he was snitching?
Because he was snitching on his own people. Snitching, yes, because he was a traitor, basically.
Simpson gets a high off these interviews. She gets to recount the crime. She gets to remember the most sensational aspects of the crime. By putting a mirror in front of him and showing him how badly beaten he is, it's deflating to the victim. Victims start to, at some point, give up hope. And when an individual is sadistic and they need that high, it banks on the victim fighting, resisting, showing force and fear.
And now?
A nail hammered into his head? That would be insane. That's your 3-inch nail thing?
Did you do that?
Nail in my head from my creator.
So what's the significance of that?
I just told you.
Again, the nail in my head from my creator? What does that mean to you?
It's a song.
Okay, educate me here. So why the nail in the head?
It's not in the head in the song, actually. I don't know.
She's referencing a song, Show Me How to Live by Audioslave. Her decision to throw this idea out there that she was following the lyrics of a song, I think is just an impulsive response to the investigator. She then clarifies that's not actually the lyric. It should have been the hand instead of the head. This has absolutely nothing to do with the crime. She did impale a 3-inch nail into the victim's head, and I think that was a plain and simple decision to turn the temperature up on the amount of torture she subjected the victim to.
Why did you put the nail in the head?
Why does there have to be a reason? I did use a hammer, my favorite hammer, actually, that was already kind of distorted from previous to break him. It's cracked up pretty easy. You know how it is. I drug him to the bathroom before I left.
This is after you cut his throat.
Yeah. And drove him to the bathroom, went get some funds, celebrate, went back up, cut his legs off.
What did you use?
I used a long knife. I started actually with a paring knife.
So when did you first start cutting him up?
I first started cutting him up about 8 hours after he was dead.
Is he stiff or is he...
He's a little rigger, yeah.
People with psychopathic traits are apt to target people that are weaker or vulnerable because they're easy to overtake. They have a strong sense of knowing when someone is going to be an easier target, and they will prey on them. It's likely that she thought that because of his disability, he was someone that she could more easily overpower and kill. basically. She wanted to be able to have someone who she would be able to take out without a lot of effort.
Did you find anything unique with his
I
leg?
did. I most certainly did.
What'd
Quite
you-
unique.
What'd you find?
Little, like, metal pieces inside of his knee. They were quite exquisite, kind of like the old phone line poles. And they were blue. But yeah, it was quite unique.
Okay.
Kind of hard to, but it worked out. I just kind of do the outside, like perforation, step on the top, crack, crack. I kind of like the whole hands-on twist-off thing.
He was physically disabled. Her decision to dismember him and cut into even where he had had knee surgery really just speaks to this was a science experiment for her. This was really no different than how a high school student might dissect an eyeball of an animal, a cat, a frog. This is someone who did not see this as a human being. This was just for her own stimulation and benefit and her own curiosity, really.
So you took 2.5 days to cut him off, or did you 3.5?
3.5.
So Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. That's
I was very high just on the act alone, dude. I believe it was 3 days I spent with him, possibly 4.
so nobody saw you.
Nobody had nothing to do with that but me. Bagged him up. I left a wing and a thigh in a trash can somewhere. I'm not sure which one, where, or why, but
Okay, what do you mean a wing?
a wing and a thigh. I left something of him somewhere else.
Simpson's description of the victim and his limbs as if it's a chicken carcass being cut up for a roast and for dinner really speaks to just how much she dehumanized her victim, how her relationship with people is 100% instrumental. It was about getting high. She took that opportunity to celebrate her kill, and she was proud of what she did. There's absolutely no doubt about that. You see that pride in how she recounts what she's done to him.
Okay, I put him up on a thing after his legs were cut off. I put him up on a thing on a little bucket in the bathroom and pointed his finger, you know, like he did back in the day. It's the person in the room, Your Honor, you know, right there he is, just to make him look like he, you know, how he's comfortable sitting on a stand. After I got Terry out of the house, I cleaned it with bleach, a lot of bleach,
Clean what?
the walls.
Okay. What about the carpet?
I ripped it out.
In what room?
Why are you asking me these things, dude? You know I did it. You know I did it. You know I'm not lying.
She gets annoyed when they're asking, when she has to explain, did she clean the walls? Did she get rid of the carpet? And she sees all that as irrelevant. That's tedious. Those are trivia. Those are non-important to her. This is the narcissist response in psychopathy to being asked detailed questions. Because if she thought they were important, she already would have mentioned it. And you see the irritability, because that's the confrontation between who's running this thing. And so she says, that's irrelevant. And she dismisses it.
I put it in the dumpster. Are you still pretty stuck? It's pretty heavy. I think I did throw a foot in there.
So whatever limb you threw in there.
Yes, whatever's missing from where you found the snitch is in the dumpster.
So you got his torso in the dumpster. The garbage.
Yeah,
What color was the garbage?
green.
Oh, you got that from downstairs?
I'm gonna recycle a snitch?
I think that she knows this is shocking to the interviewer. She's trying to make it funny, and nothing's funny about what she's talking about. And so we say this is that superficial and glib humor she's demonstrating. One impact of the behavior is that it controls the interviewer's attention. It's an emotional lure. It's playing with the interviewer. The other one is that it projects an image that she's beyond feelings of these things that we all might find horrifying, which is a superiority view. Like, I'm beyond the thing that you might find shocking.
Did you wrap it, or was it just by itself?
I covered it,
With what?
a blanket.
Okay. And put it in the trunk.
Put it in the trunk and then covered it with a blanket. It was much easier to flip the bitch out,
And what?
strike a match, and right on,
You lit the match, start on fire.
and drove off.
Well, how'd the wheelchair get down?
I drove it.
Like you're sitting on it?
Sat on it and rode it down the street. Took me a minute too, as smart as I think I am. God damn.
Took a while to figure out how it goes.
Couldn't figure out how it goes.
You going Mach 2 or what?
Oh my God. Like I was driving a stick shift. Tried to steal a stick shift once, big mistake.
This seems to be another way that she was celebrating. It was kind of a victory lap with this chair that he was presumably known by in the community. So she feels like she won this battle, did a good thing, and was showing off, essentially. This is not someone who did a terrible thing and is trying to evade capture. This is someone who is literally riding around town on the wheelchair.
Well, have you cut up anybody else?
No.
This is your first person?
I think we have enough. Have we not enough?
Right? And stuff doesn't bother her. And she's not going to get other people involved because she can do it. She's done it before, but we're not going to talk about that. It's teasing.
When did you first start killing animals?
I don't know. Probably 6.
When you're 6 years old?
Probably. Why? No, I'm going to start lying now, dude. What the
With psychopathic individuals, when they have a history of animal harm, it's not surprising that it starts during childhood. Oftentimes, they start with small animals such as birds, squirrels, hamsters, the family rodent, the family cat, the family dog. And the significance of starting with small animals is that they're easy to overtake. They're easy to overpower. It's easy to control them. When Simpson references that she hasn't gotten an elk yet, that's both a reference to her being a predator and a hunter, and everyone else that's living being prey.
Why did you ask me about cats?
Because there's dead cats in the area?
Shut up,
I'm
dude.
serious.
That's the only reason. You thought I might have something to do with some dead cats in the area?
It's a hunch.
Well, you know, pussies die. Whatever. Thank you. I'd appreciate the opportunity, if you wouldn't mind giving it to me, to speak with and have more interrogations with other snitches later in life. If you can handle
I
that.
bet you would.
Yes.
If I come over to your table, does that mean I'm innocent? Just a thought, you know, since my lawyer ain't showed up yet. He's probably stuck in the elevator somewhere. Kind of reminds me of the Three Stooges, sorry. Which one gets to be mom?
Everyone is wondering what's happened. Of course, it's a small town, and you know, you just don't think things like this are going to happen here. And everyone's just concerned, and our hearts go out for the families.
Family members mill about as sheriff's deputies, the Division of Criminal Investigation, and Altoona Rescue Crew, and then Des Moines Crime Scene Mobile Command descend on the farmstead. Tonight, hope for a break in the case. Investigators want to find a red 1995 Chevy Tahoe. The sheriff's office believes a man named Russell Overland is driving this truck. The big question tonight, could Russell Overland explain what led investigators to spend much of the night digging in the elderly couple's backyard?
Russ, about, when the last time you saw your folks, saw your dad and your stepmom? Well, let's see. I'm pretty sure I talked with him Saturday because I carried some corn in the house.
Where you been living?
Just, well, since September, I've been staying at camper at my dad's place.
Who else lives there?
Where?
At your dad's place.
Just my dad and my stepmom.
Overland's history is consistent with somebody who is displaying a parasitic lifestyle. He hasn't been able to hold down jobs consistently. He has not only employment instability because of his work performance, but because interpersonally, he doesn't seem mature enough to realize how you handle interactions with bosses. He's in his 50s living on his parents' property in a trailer that they own.
So you're saying on Sunday you didn't see your dad and Naomi at all that day?
No. I know they went to church because the car was gone.
You watch the news? Watch TV on the way down? You know, when you stop at the motel, I'm assuming you watch the news?
Just the weather, basically.
Your dad and your stepmom were found dead.
Really?
Yep. What can you tell us about it?
I was kind of hoping to play dumb, but obviously playing dumb
Isn't gonna work
so far. You found them, the bodies, right?
The reaction of really is not a normal reaction to finding out your parents are dead. Even if he maintained he didn't kill them or tried to pretend that he didn't, that reaction is just, it's incredibly telling. The detective knows what's going on just from that.
He's sitting back in his chair, almost twiddling his thumbs. Then he asks the question, so you found them, or you found the bodies? So then he turns around to poking to see how much do they know. Someone with psychopathy, they like to control the situation. They want to slowly dispense the information they have because it will all be about them. It's going to make them work.
Where do you suppose we found him?
I know exactly where you found them.
Can you tell me where we found him?
In a cistern.
Can you tell me what happened?
I killed him. I hate my stepmom.
You do?
I honestly say that I can really, truly say that I hate her.
What about your dad?
She made me feel unwelcome in the house.
Why don't you tell us the details of how it happened?
I beat him to death with a baseball bat.
There's no remorse in what he describes. It's as if he's just giving the facts. It happened this way, almost if you were narrating what was on a video. It's sort of this commentary on his own actions that's really indifferent and detached.
I had enough. When I got back from church, I did it in the back porch.
Were you waiting for him to come home from church?
I was waiting for him. Naomi came in first. I was waiting by the deep freeze. She walked up and I came at her right away with the baseball bat. Anyway, Father came after that, came through the door and says, "What the hell's going on here?" And I didn't really have a good explanation for him. I hit her with it, probably 2 or 3 times. Then when Father said, "Well, you better go somewhere or get out of here or whatever," he says, "I'm going to call 911. When he started to go through the door into the kitchen, I hit him from behind and took care of him.
How many times you hit him?
Probably half a dozen. And I finished him off with a pillow. Smothered him.
Where's the pillow from?
Got it from their bed.
What'd you do after that?
Well, after it took a long time for to kill my dad. I didn't realize it'd take that long to smother somebody. But
How long do you think it took?
half an hour? I don't know. I was really surprised. But then after I got done with him, I went back and I wailed on Mama some more. She wasn't completely dead.
How many times do you think you hit her altogether?
Dozen, 15, whatever.
Overland's description of a fairly gruesome crime and the amount of effort that it took for him to kill his stepmother and his father is, again, just very matter of fact. He's not fazed by the fact that he was violently involved in any kind of interaction with them. But the fact that he returned to his stepmother and then beat her the number of times that he did suggests that in that moment he lost control and the only emotions he was in touch with were his anger and rage towards her.
What'd you do after that, Russ?
There was a blade on the front of the loader that he used for pushing snow. I took that off, 2 bolts, used the loader, did Naomi first, put her in the well. Had a hard time getting father out the other door.
Did you have them both in the loader or just her?
One at a time.
One at a time. Did her and then him?
Ladies first.
I think a lot of his odd attempts at humor are much more for his own enjoyment, the kind of in-jokes with himself, and less for the detectives. His ladies first, with a little bit of emotion, kind of a chuckle almost. That's concerning. It's callous. When we see emotion, it's dark.
I had a half kind of what I intended on doing was moving out of county, and I didn't know whether I'd be able to do it or not, but get my dad's checking account transferred to another bank, and then I was going to try and use his Social Security checks.
Okay.
Because I figured I could forge his name, you know. Naomi, I don't look like Naomi, but I do have her middle name. She writes like a serial killer.
She writes like one?
She has got a very poor penmanship.
Oh, yeah?
The statement that his stepmother wrote like a serial killer is another demonstration of a really glib attitude. On the one hand, glorifying his actions, and on the other hand, he's really reducing his stepmother's reputation and her existence down to something that justifies his behavior.
Russ, was there anything that was the straw that broke the camel's back, or just Sunday morning you decided that was the day?
Like a rest area or an outhouse.
He's complaining that she's saying that it's making the place smell like an outhouse. Or the simple fact to ask him to take shoes off coming into the house. This is enraging to him. We think that those kinds of things reflect a very, very fragile ego on the person's part. They feel insulted very easily because he thinks what he's doing is just fine.
I'm in trouble with credit cards, and they were going after my dad's property because he had my name on the will that I would inherit it. So they were going to put a lien against it. So that made my dad mad, and he had to end up paying $6,500 to settle that bill. So that's another reason that I'm sure that Naomi hated me, because I was a bum. But I am a bum. I've been living off my dad, you know, really I've been staying in a camper at my dad's place, but it's poor living, if you want to call it that.
He owns the phrase, I'm a bum. There's some kind of self-loathing there that he's in the circumstances he's in. I'm wondering how much that financial reality is what kind of catalyzed it happening when it happened. Because suddenly he couldn't just cruise maybe the way he had.
Between the low self-esteem from my dad and the negative feelings, feedback I'm getting from her, I truly say that I don't miss either one. I realize what I've done is bad, But like it's to me, it's a camel or a straw that broke the camel's back. She just basically made me feel as unwelcome as the plague.
Sounds like this is kind of building up over a period of time then.
It has. I have been literally thinking about it for at least 4 years. Because if I want to admit to it, I think I truly hate her.
Okay. You're being honest, it sounds like.
Russ, did anybody talk you into doing this to your dad and stepmom?
My own idea.
Did it on your own?
My first, long time ago, I was thinking about smothering them in bed when they're asleep. But I didn't really know how effective it would be, doing them both at the same time. So then my next thought was to get them while they're both watching Wheel of Fortune. In my way of thinking, I didn't think that I could do them separately. I might be able to do Father first and then Naomi. But I thought if I took her out of the picture first, I'd have to do Father.
Overland's planning is somewhat half-baked. He doesn't really think through the logistics of how he's going to live on the run. He spends 4 years lying in wait in his head, trying to plot out the perfect way to get rid of them. But even there, you hear this lack of effort. He didn't want to have to struggle to do it. And then ultimately, he decides on a Sunday, while they're at church, that that's the day he's going to do it. And he lays in wait for them to come home and then bludgeons them both to death.
Simple logistics or whatever, try to do the most effective job. I was going to do her 2 weeks ago with the axe. I thought, well, now I ain't sure how effective a baseball bat would be. A solid, one good whack. Not that I'm trying to be Lizzie Borden.
Lizzie Borden is a well-known case of a woman who in the 1890s killed her own father and stepmother and stood trial for that. And the fact that Overland chooses to draw that parallel, I think, speaks to his own ego. He's proud of what he's done. This is somewhat self-aggrandizing. He's making himself important. He's making himself elevated in terms of his status.
But I did dump Naomi in the well. She was still alive. And to me, that gave me great pleasure. She was still struggling. She was still semi-conscious. She wasn't dead yet.
Did she say anything?
Not that I recall. Kind of groaning or whatever.
She went in first?
Yeah, head first. In fact, I had a little trouble getting her arms, because her arms kind of butterfly pattern, so I had to kind of play with her a little bit to get her right arm to go down. But plop, plop, fizz, fizz. Oh, what a relief it is.
The idea of being thrown into a well while you're still alive, horror movies are made on the topic. It's something that most people have a very strong emotional reaction to. He's talking about how much joy he took from it. That's some impressive sadism.
I suppose I should be more remorseful. I have mildly thought several times of suicide. But I'm too chicken to try anything. I thought about hanging myself in the barn several times, but I'm too scared to do it. I thought, I've seen it on movies, I don't know if it actually worked, but I thought if you toss a radio in the bathtub, would it actually kill you? I think it would if you was in a tub full of water, but I'm not real sure.
I think you could probably get the job done that way.
And when he's talking about suicide, I don't think he's describing so much depression, but he's describing feeling rejected from the entire world and not having a place in it. He's probably spent a lot of his life feeling horrible. Horrible and judged and not appreciated and entitled and not getting attention or acknowledgement.
Basically, the reason I don't seriously contemplate getting rid of myself, I figured I'd have my heart attack before now, but hasn't happened. And I think I'm in fairly reasonably good health. I can't seem to find a job that I like. I'm basically alone in the world, except for the folks. I'm taking care of them. I'm not close with any of my siblings. Not real close. You look sadder than I do.
Him telling police that they look sadder than he does, I think actually shows some insight. It shows a little bit of awareness and willingness to say, yeah, I'm not motivated by the same things most people are. I thought I'd be dead by now. I'm still here. And he doesn't really want to continue to live. He doesn't get anything out of this life. Instead of getting busy living, he's waiting to die.
If I come over to your table, does that mean I'm innocent? Just a thought, since my lawyer ain't showed up yet. He's probably stuck in the elevator somewhere. Kind of reminds me of the Three Stooges. Sorry. Which one gets to be mom?
He is the center of attention. And for him, that's got to be satisfying, because this might be the most notoriety in me.
The first sound was not a scream, not a gunshot, not even a crash, but the thin metallic click of a payphone being put back on its hook somewhere off Holloway Road, a sound so ordinary it vanished into the night. And yet by morning it would be replayed in the minds of detectives who did not yet know they were standing at the edge of a cold case that would refuse to die. London, 1987, a city breathing out coal dust and cigarette smoke, neon reflected in wet pavement, sirens threading through tower blocks like nervous whispers, and in a narrow flat above a takeaway that never quite closed, time stopped. When the door was forced open hours later, the room smelled wrong. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just stale air and something faintly metallic, and on the carpet lay a body arranged in a way that suggested haste rather than ritual, as if whoever had been there wanted to leave before the city noticed. The victim was young enough to still be underestimated and old enough to have secrets, a Londoner by paperwork if not by soul, working nights, keeping irregular hours, known to neighbors as quiet, polite, forgettable, the kind of person whose absence registers slowly. Like a missed train you only realize you needed when it's already gone. There were no signs of a struggle that mattered, no overturned furniture, no broken glass glittering like clues, just a life interrupted and a silence that settled heavy over the stairwell. The radio in the kitchen was still on, low volume, a late-night presenter talking about traffic on the North Circular, and detectives would later say that detail bothered them most, because it suggested the violence had slipped into the room without announcing itself. By midday the street was cordoned off, blue and white tape fluttering in the damp air, drawing the attention of passers-by who leaned in with the same curiosity they'd use for a shop window. Word spread quickly, as it always does, faster than facts, faster than names, faster than truth, and by evening the local papers were already sharpening their headlines, the phrase mysterious death doing a lot of work to hide how little anyone actually knew. Officers knocked on doors, notebooks open, asking the same questions in different ways: who had been seen, who had been heard, who had come and gone in the small hours, and the answers were variations of the same shrug, the same uncertainty. The same London habit of minding your own business until it's too late. Inside the flat, forensic lights swept across surfaces that had been wiped too carefully and not carefully enough, fingerprints smudged into abstract art, fibers clinging to a sleeve, a half-empty mug of tea gone cold, milk forming a skin on top. There was no murder weapon in sight, no note, no obvious motive screaming from the walls, and that absence would become the case's defining feature. Detectives argued quietly over theories that felt thin even as they spoke them aloud. A dispute gone wrong, a lover's quarrel, a debt unpaid, the usual suspects lined up like ghosts, each one fading under scrutiny. The victim's routine was reconstructed from fragments, bus tickets, times scribbled in a diary, a neighbor's memory of footsteps on the stairs, and yet the more they learned, the less it added up, as if the truth had been deliberately scattered and hidden among ordinary details. The community reacted the way communities do when the threat is undefined, with a mix of fear and denial, curtains twitching, locks checked twice, pub conversations dropping to a hush when strangers walked in. Parents warned their children without explaining why, and shopkeepers kept their lights on a little later, just in case. The name of the street became shorthand for unease, a reference point in conversations that ended with nervous laughter, and somewhere in all of it was the unspoken question that no one wanted to ask out loud. If it could happen here, to someone like that, could it happen to anyone? The investigation moved fast at first, as they always do, adrenaline carrying it forward, officers chasing leads that felt promising until they weren't. A man seen arguing outside the building vanished into the sprawl of the city. A coworker's alibi dissolved under pressure and then reformed with witnesses who couldn't be shaken. A rumor about money changed hands so often it lost its shape. Each lead was logged, each theory tested, each disappointment added another layer of frustration, and weeks turned into months without the satisfying click of answers falling into place. Evidence was boxed, labeled, shelved, the case file thickening into something heavy enough to hurt if it fell. By the time winter came, the flat had been relet, the tape long gone, the memory of flashing lights replaced by new tenants who avoided asking questions, and yet the detectives assigned to the case carried it with them, a low-grade fever that flared whenever a similar crime crossed their desks. They revisited the scene in their minds, replayed interviews, circled back to details that had seemed insignificant at the time, the radio, the mug, the timing of that unanswered phone call logged by the exchange, and each time they came up empty-handed. London kept moving, as it always does, swallowing tragedies whole, and the case slipped quietly into the category no one wanted to admit existed, unsolved, unresolved, a cold case forming while no one was looking. Years passed. The city changed its face, Thatcher's Britain giving way to something sharper, brighter, louder, CCTV blooming on street corners like mechanical flowers, technology promising answers that had once been impossible. The file was pulled out occasionally, dust brushed off, pages reread by fresh eyes that hoped distance might reveal what proximity had hidden, and still the same question sat there, patient and mocking. Who had been there and why? How had they known the victim would be alone? What had gone wrong that night that turned routine into catastrophe? The victim's family aged under the weight of not knowing, birthdays marked by absence, anniversaries by the dull ache of uncertainty, and every phone call from an unknown number carried the same impossible hope. When the case was officially declared cold, the words landed with a thud, a bureaucratic acknowledgement that time had won this round, that resources were finite, that answers were not guaranteed. But cold did not mean forgotten, not entirely. It meant waiting, evidence sleeping in boxes, memories fading at different speeds, guilt and innocence blurring together in the dark. Every so often a journalist would revive the story, printing the same grainy photograph, asking the same unanswered questions, and for a day or two the name would surface again, before sinking back beneath the noise. Then, decades later, something shifted. A tip came in that didn't fit the pattern, a voice on the line that didn't sound like attention-seeking or grief-stricken speculation, but steady, measured, heavy with something that could have been remorse or could have been performance. A name was mentioned that hadn't appeared in the file before, or had, but only in the margins, dismissed at the time for lack of substance. Detectives, older now, or replaced by a new generation trained to distrust coincidence, reopened the boxes, lifted out the evidence, and felt that familiar mix of hope and dread, the sense that the past was about to speak, and it might not say what anyone wanted to hear. London barely noticed at first. Cold cases reopening don't make headlines until they do, until an arrest, until a confession, until the word solved is dangled like a promise. In the background, interviews were conducted, records checked, DNA tested with tools that didn't exist in 1987, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the narrative began to tighten. A confession emerged, Unexpected, delivered without theatrics, a man stepping forward to say he knew what had happened in that flat above the takeaway all those years ago, and for a moment it felt like the long night was finally ending. But confessions are not endings, not always. They are beginnings of new questions, new doubts, new fractures in the story people thought they knew. As the case was reopened, as files were scrutinized under unforgiving modern light, it became clear that the truth, whatever it was, had survived for 36 years by adapting, by hiding in plain sight, by letting assumptions do the work of concealment. The city watched, breath held, as the cold case warmed under scrutiny, and somewhere between the past and the present, the echo of that payphone clicking back into place still lingered, a small, ordinary sound marking the moment everything changed and nothing was ever truly resolved. The confession landed like a match struck in a long-abandoned room, brief light, sharp heat, shadows leaping to life on walls everyone thought they knew, and suddenly every assumption from 1987 was back on the table, every detail suspect again. The man who came forward did not look like a headline, did not fit the silhouette the papers had sketched for decades. He was ordinary to the point of invisibility, a life spent passing through crowds without leaving an impression. And that was what unsettled the detectives most as they watched him sit across the table, hands folded, voice even, eyes fixed on a spot just past the recorder. He spoke of London as it had been then, the noise, the anonymity, the way you could disappear inside a city that never asked your name, and as he talked, the past began to feel less distant, less sepia-toned, more present, like a bruise pressed too often. He described that night without drama, without flourish, the way someone might recount a commute, and that lack of emotion set off alarms in the room. He knew details that hadn't been public, the layout of the flat, the way the light from the street lamp cut across the carpet, the radio murmuring in the background, and yet when pressed on the moments that mattered, the why, the turning point, his answers softened, blurred, slid sideways. He said things happened too fast, that he hadn't planned anything, that it was an accident, words so familiar they sounded rehearsed, and the detectives exchanged glances that carried decades of shared experience, knowing how often truth hides behind the most convenient language. As the interview stretched on, the city outside carried on, buses roaring past, phones buzzing with updates that hadn't yet reached the public, and inside the room the weight of history pressed down. Every sentence was checked against the file, every claim tested against evidence that had slept for 36 years. Some of it lined up neatly, unsettling in its precision. Other parts didn't fit at all, jagged edges that refused to smooth out no matter how hard they were pushed. The confession filled gaps, but it also created new ones, and that, the detectives knew, was where cold cases often went to die a second death, under the burden of almost answers. The victim's name, once faded from memory, was spoken again in briefings and court documents, in phone calls to family members who had learned not to hope too loudly. When they were told there had been a confession, the reaction was not relief but caution, a tightening of the jaw, a pause heavy with the knowledge that closure is a fragile thing, easily promised, easily taken away. They had lived too long with questions to trust a single voice, no matter how convincing it sounded. The past had taught them that certainty, when it finally arrives, often comes wrapped in conditions. Reporters circled as rumors leaked, phrases like cold case reopened and shock confession appearing in print and online, the story gaining momentum as if the city itself had been waiting for an excuse to look back. Old photographs resurfaced, black and white images scanned and shared, the victim frozen in time, smiling at a camera that didn't know what was coming. Neighbors from 1987 were tracked down, asked to remember things they hadn't thought about in years, and memory proved as unreliable as ever, bending under the pressure of suggestion, reshaped by headlines and hindsight. Behind the scenes, forensic teams worked methodically, extracting what they could from evidence preserved beyond its expected lifespan. Fibers were re-examined, fingerprints run through databases that didn't exist when Margaret Thatcher was still in Downing Street, and DNA, the silent witness everyone had learned to trust, was coaxed from samples so degraded they barely qualified as evidence. The results were promising enough to keep hope alive and ambiguous enough to prevent celebration. Matches were partial. Timelines overlapped without aligning. The science spoke, but not clearly, and the confession hovered over it all like a shadow, influencing interpretations whether anyone wanted it to or not. The man at the center of it remained calm as the scrutiny intensified, repeating his story with minor variations that could be chalked up to memory or manipulation. He acknowledged being there, acknowledged contact, acknowledged moments that had never been documented, and yet when confronted with contradictions, he adjusted smoothly, too smoothly, as if the truth were something flexible, something to be shaped until it fit the space available. Detectives pressed harder, probing for cracks, moments of anger or fear, but he offered none, only a steady stream of explanations that felt practiced, if not prepared. As weeks passed, the initial surge of excitement gave way to something more familiar, frustration creeping back in, the sense that the case was resisting resolution as fiercely as it had in 1987. Legal teams weighed the strength of the confession against the weaknesses of the evidence, debating what could stand up in court, what would crumble under cross-examination. The word insufficient surfaced in conversations that had once brimmed with optimism, and with it came the fear that the reopening might end not with answers, but with another official acknowledgement of uncertainty. The community that had once whispered now spoke openly, social media amplifying opinions that swung wildly between certainty and suspicion. Some saw the confession as justice delayed but delivered, a wrong finally righted. Others questioned motives, pointing to the timing, the gaps, the lack of definitive proof, and in pubs and comment sections alike, the same argument played out, belief versus doubt, the human need for stories with endings clashing against the stubborn complexity of reality. The city watched itself debate, old scars reopening alongside the case. For the detectives, the work became as much about resisting narrative as uncovering fact. They knew how easily a confession could become a lens through which everything else was viewed, how dangerous it was to let one account dominate a case built on fragments. They returned again to the beginning, to that ordinary sound of a payphone clicking back into place, to the unanswered questions that had survived every technological advance and procedural overhaul. Who else had been there? What had been missed? Why the scene felt both disturbed and carefully preserved, as if someone had wanted to erase themselves without erasing what had happened. Late nights blurred into early mornings as files were spread across tables, connections sketched and erased, timelines rewritten. The past felt close enough to touch, and yet just out of reach, like a voice heard through a wall. Every potential breakthrough carried with it the risk of collapse, and the detectives moved carefully, aware that the eyes of the city were on them now, that the promise of resolution had been made whether they liked it or not. To fail again would not just be a professional disappointment, but a public one, a reopening that led nowhere. And still, beneath the noise, beneath the arguments and the headlines, the core mystery remained intact, stubborn, unyielding. The confession had changed the shape of the case without filling it in, adding a new layer of complexity to a story already dense with unanswered questions. As the investigation pushed forward, driven by equal parts determination and doubt, it became clear that whatever truth lay buried in 1987 had learned how to survive attention. The cold case was no longer dormant, but it was far from solved, and as London moved through another season, the echo of that night continued to reverberate, a reminder that some mysteries don't end when someone speaks, but when every silence has finally been understood. The deeper they pushed, the more the case resisted simple geometry, lines refusing to meet no matter how carefully they were drawn. Timelines were pinned to walls, color-coded and annotated. The night of the killings stretched thin, minute by minute, until it felt elastic, capable of accommodating almost anything. The confession was slotted in like a keystone, but instead of stabilizing the arch, it made the structure wobble, weight shifting in uncomfortable ways. Detectives began to notice what the confession did not say, the pauses where specifics should have been, the moments brushed aside as confusion or memory loss, and those absences spoke loudly in rooms where silence had always been suspect. They returned to witnesses long dismissed, voices that had been too soft or too inconsistent to matter in 1987, and found that time had altered them in unexpected ways. Some memories had sharpened, calcified by repetition and regret. Others had softened, blurred by decades of living, but even in their uncertainty, patterns emerged. A neighbor remembered footsteps that didn't match the confessed timeline. A shop owner recalled a face lingering too long in the doorway across the street, a reminder that the city had always been watching, even when it didn't understand what it was seeing. None of it was conclusive. All of it mattered. The flat itself became a character again, revisited by forensic specialists who treated it like an archaeological site, scraping away layers of assumption rather than dust. Renovations over the years had changed its shape, but measurements taken from old photographs and council records allowed them to reconstruct the space as it had been. The angles of light, the distances between doorways, the way sound traveled through thin walls. Experiments were run, footsteps timed, voices raised and muffled, and slowly a picture formed that complicated everything the confession claimed. Certain actions would have been difficult to hide. Certain sounds should have carried. The radio, once a footnote, returned to prominence, its volume setting questioned, its timing scrutinized, its presence no longer benign. As the case grew louder, the man who had confessed grew quieter, his cooperation steady but limited, his answers increasingly careful. Legal counsel appeared more frequently, conversation shortened, and the dynamic shifted from exploration to negotiation. Detectives felt the window narrowing, the moment when curiosity would be replaced by strategy, and they pushed where they could, aware that every question asked now might be the last answered freely. They pressed on motive again, on the relationship between the man and the victim, on how two lives had intersected so fatally, and the answers, when they came, felt borrowed, shaped by what the case needed rather than what had actually happened. Outside the interview rooms, the story took on a life of its own. Headlines hardened into narratives, timelines simplified for consumption, the confession treated as fact by some, as manipulation by others. Armchair detectives dissected every detail. Podcasts sprang up overnight, each promising to uncover what the police had missed, and in the noise, nuance was flattened, doubt framed as incompetence or conspiracy. The pressure mounted, not just to solve the case, but to solve it convincingly, to produce an ending that could withstand the scrutiny of a city trained to question authority. The victim's family watched from the edge of this storm, pulled back into a public grief they had learned to carry privately. Interviews were requested, statements drafted and redrafted, every word weighed for its potential to be misinterpreted. They wanted answers, but not at the cost of truth, and that distinction became harder to maintain as the narrative accelerated. Closure was offered like a product, packaged neatly, ready for delivery, and they hesitated, aware that accepting it prematurely could mean living with the wrong story forever. In the lab, results trickled in, never enough to declare victory, never weak enough to abandon hope. A fiber matched a batch manufactured in the late 80s, common enough to be unremarkable, rare enough to be interesting. A partial print excluded some suspects and implicated none. DNA results hovered in the gray space between possibility and proof, their ambiguity a reminder that science, for all its power, could only work with what it was given. The confession sat alongside these findings like an unruly witness, influencing interpretations even as it refused to be confirmed by them. Detectives began to suspect that the case's greatest obstacle was not a lack of information, but an excess of it, layers of story built up over time, each one obscuring the original event a little more. They stripped the case back to its essentials, asking questions that felt almost naive after so many years. Who had opportunity? Who had knowledge? Who had something to gain? And in doing so, they rediscovered overlooked connections, relationships that had seemed too mundane to matter, routines that intersected in ways no one had mapped before. The city of 1987 emerged again, not as nostalgia, but as a network of movements and habits, predictable and exploitable. One name resurfaced repeatedly, not the confessors, but someone adjacent, someone who had hovered at the edges of the investigation without ever stepping fully into the light. In 1987, they had been dismissed as peripheral, their inconsistencies attributed to stress or coincidence. Now, viewed through the lens of modern analysis, those inconsistencies looked different, less like noise and more like signal. Interviews were scheduled, records pulled, and the sense grew that the confession might not be the center of the story, but a distraction from it, a false summit that tempted climbers to stop before reaching the peak. The man who had confessed was confronted with this shift, presented with new information, alternative timelines, suggestions that his version of events did not account for everything. His reaction was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a pause before answering, but to detectives trained to read micro-expressions and silence, it was enough to register. He doubled down on certain claims, retreated from others, and in that movement, questions multiplied. Was he protecting someone? Was he misremembering? Or was the confession itself a construct, designed to control a narrative that threatened to escape him? As the investigation stretched on, fatigue set in, not just among the detectives, but within the institutions supporting them. Resources were finite. Attention spans shorter still. The longer the case went without a definitive breakthrough, the louder the whispers became about diminishing returns, about the wisdom of investing so much in a past that refused to yield. And yet, to step back now felt impossible. The cost of retreat measured not just in money, but in credibility, in the trust of a community that had been promised answers. Late one evening, as rain streaked down the windows of an office that had seen too many long nights, a detective revisited a detail that had never sat right, a small discrepancy in the timing of that initial phone call logged by the exchange. Cross-referenced with transport records and witness statements newly re-examined, it suggested a window of time that had been miscalculated from the start. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even a revelation. But it was enough to shift the frame, to suggest that the sequence of events might have unfolded differently than anyone had assumed, including the man who claimed to know exactly how it happened. That possibility hung in the air as the team regrouped, aware that they might be standing at the edge of yet another recalibration, another turn in a case that seemed to thrive on reinvention. The cold case had warmed under scrutiny, but it had not softened. If anything, it had grown more complex, more resistant to simple conclusions. And as London moved through its present, unaware of how closely its past was being examined, the investigation pressed on, guided by the uneasy understanding that the truth, when it finally emerged, might not resemble the confession that had promised so much, but something far more unsettling. Hidden in the gaps everyone had been too eager to fill. By the time the new timeline took shape, it was clear the case had been living on borrowed assumptions, each one stacked neatly on top of the last until no one remembered which were facts and which were conveniences. The recalculated window was narrow, almost cruel in its precision, a slice of time that excluded people who had long carried suspicion and included others who had never felt its weight. It reframed movements across the city, bus routes that suddenly mattered, late trains that arrived early enough to change everything, and in doing so it cast the confession in a harsher light. If the timing was wrong, then either memory had failed catastrophically or the story had never been anchored to truth in the first place. Detectives moved quietly, resisting the urge to announce progress that might evaporate under scrutiny. They traced the victim's final hours again, not as a narrative, but as data, points on a map connected by probability rather than belief. Phone records, once primitive, were now treated like fossils, incomplete but informative, their gaps as telling as their entries. That unanswered call, long assumed to be a dead end, began to look like a pivot, its placement within the revised timeline suggesting intent rather than accident. Someone had tried to reach out. Someone had failed. And in that failure, something had shifted. Attention returned to the street itself, the way it functioned at night, the rhythm of deliveries, the closing times of nearby shops, the predictable lull between the last customers and the early morning cleanups. In 1987, this had been background noise. Now it was foreground, a living system that could hide movement in plain sight. Witness statements were relayered over this framework, not taken at face value, but weighted by context. A sound remembered as late might have been earlier. A figure described as tall might have seemed so only because the light was low and the street empty. Perception bent under pressure, and detectives accounted for that bend with a rigor that hadn't been possible before. The adjacent name, the one that refused to fade back into the margins, became unavoidable. Their proximity to both victim and scene had always been acknowledged, but never interrogated with this level of intensity. In 1987, they had been cooperative, helpful even, offering explanations that smoothed over rough edges. Now those explanations were pulled apart, tested against the revised timeline, and found wanting. Small inconsistencies multiplied, not enough to accuse, but too many to ignore. Their movements that night, once unremarkable, now intersected with the critical window in ways that felt uncomfortably precise. When approached again, decades later, their demeanor was different, not hostile, but guarded, as if they understood the stakes had shifted. Answers came slowly, carefully phrased, memories suddenly uncertain where once they had been clear. The passage of time was offered as explanation, a reasonable defense, but detectives noted where uncertainty clustered, around moments that mattered most. It was in those clusters that the case seemed to breathe, to pulse with the possibility of something long concealed. Meanwhile, the man who had confessed sensed the change in gravity. His earlier confidence gave way to irritation, then to something closer to anxiety, though it never fully surfaced. He questioned the need for further investigation, emphasized his willingness to accept responsibility, framed the reopening as unnecessary suffering for everyone involved. To seasoned ears, it sounded less like contrition and more like control, an attempt to steer the outcome by limiting the scope of inquiry. Confessions, detectives knew, could be weapons as much as admissions, tools used to shape truth rather than reveal it. Legal considerations tightened their grip on the process. Every interview was now conducted with an awareness of how easily missteps could unravel months of work. The possibility loomed that the confession, flawed as it appeared, might still be the strongest element available, a paradox that threatened to trap the case between doubt and insufficiency. Prosecutors weighed options, discussed thresholds, argued over whether ambiguity could ever be overcome by narrative coherence. The question was no longer just who had done it, but whether the system could prove anything at all. Public patience thinned. The story that had once promised resolution now delivered complexity, and complexity does not trend well. Accusations of incompetence surfaced alongside conspiracy theories, each feeding off the other. Some insisted the confession was being undermined deliberately, others that it was a convenient distraction from institutional failure. The noise was relentless, and through it all, the victim's name was repeated, invoked, sometimes forgotten in favor of personalities and speculation. Justice, abstract and demanding, hovered just out of reach. In quieter moments, detectives returned to the emotional core of the case, the human cost obscured by process. They reviewed photographs not for clues, but for reminders, a way to ground their work in something more substantial than paperwork. They listened again to old tapes, voices crackling with static, the urgency of 1987 bleeding through despite technological decay. Those voices carried fear, confusion, determination, and above all, a belief that the truth was close, closer than it would ever feel again. That belief became both inspiration and burden. A breakthrough seemed imminent when a previously overlooked document surfaced, a mundane record misfiled decades earlier. It placed the adjacent figure in a location they had not acknowledged, at a time they had claimed to be elsewhere. The discrepancy was small, but it aligned with the revised timeline with unnerving elegance. Cross-checks confirmed its authenticity, and for a moment, the room held its breath. This was not proof, not yet, but it was a thread, and in a case like this, threads were everything. The response was swift. Interviews were rescheduled. Questions sharpened. The adjacent figure was confronted with the document, their reaction measured in microseconds and muscle tension. Denial came first, then recalibration, an attempt to reconcile memory with record. The explanation offered was plausible enough to avoid immediate collapse, but it added weight to a pattern already under strain. The sense grew that the truth was no longer hiding behind a single narrative, but distributed across several, each incomplete on its own, each necessary to understand the whole. As autumn edged into winter, mirroring the season of the original crime, the case settled into a tense equilibrium. No arrests, no announcements, just the slow accumulation of pressure, the kind that reshapes outcomes quietly, without spectacle. The cold case, once thought dormant, now felt volatile, capable of change at any moment. And somewhere beneath the layers of confession, denial, memory, and evidence, the original event waited, unchanged by attention, patient, its reality intact and indifferent to how long it took to be understood. The pressure did not break things open so much as it compressed them, forcing truths closer together until distinctions blurred. Investigators began to speak less in terms of suspects and more in terms of systems, of how people moved through each other's lives, how chance encounters could be mistaken for design, and how design could hide inside routine. The adjacent figure was no longer an anomaly but a node, a point where paths crossed more often than coincidence would allow. Every interaction they'd had with the victim was re-examined, stripped of narrative and reduced to sequence, and in that reduction something unsettling emerged, a familiarity that had never been fully acknowledged, a comfort with proximity that suggested more than casual acquaintance. Old employment records were unearthed, handwritten ledgers from businesses long shuttered, and they told a story of overlapping schedules and shared spaces. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal. Just enough contact to erode the idea that the victim's life had been isolated, just enough to suggest access without force, entry without alarm. The flat above the takeaway began to look less like a private refuge and more like a waypoint, a place people passed through without drawing attention, and that reframing altered everything. The lack of struggle no longer felt puzzling. The radio playing softly no longer felt accidental. Familiarity had its own violence, quiet and efficient. The confession, when revisited in this light, read differently. Statements that had seemed detailed now appeared selective. Omissions lined up too neatly with the adjacent figure's movements, as if the narrative had been constructed to occupy space that might otherwise have been examined. Detectives resisted the temptation to declare conspiracy, but they could not ignore the alignment. Confessions, they reminded themselves, do not have to be true to be useful. They only need to be convincing enough to redirect attention, to create an anchor that keeps other possibilities drifting at bay. Financial records added another layer, incomplete but suggestive. Small sums moved between accounts, amounts too minor to trigger alarms, spaced far enough apart to feel incidental. No clear motive emerged, no smoking gun, just the faint outline of obligation, of favors exchanged and remembered. In 1987, such details would have been invisible, lost in a paper trail too vast to follow. Now they formed a constellation, faint but coherent, hinting at pressures that might have converged in that narrow window of time. The adjacent figure's circle widened under scrutiny, acquaintances interviewed, habits mapped, routines compared. People spoke of them as reliable, helpful, the kind of person who noticed when something needed doing and did it without fuss. That reputation, once a shield, now felt ambiguous. Reliability could mean predictability. Helpfulness could mean access. And access, in a case built on the absence of forced entry, was everything. Still, nothing crossed the threshold into certainty, and detectives were careful not to let implication harden into accusation. The man who had confessed grew more distant, his cooperation constrained by legal strategy, his earlier openness replaced by carefully worded statements. When confronted with the evolving theory, he denied coordination, denied knowledge beyond his own account, and emphasized again his willingness to bear responsibility. It was a move that should have simplified matters, but instead complicated them further. Accepting his confession wholesale would mean ignoring the accumulating contradictions. Rejecting it would mean admitting the case was still adrift. The investigation hovered between those poles, suspended by the weight of its own history. Media interest spiked again as whispers of a second angle leaked. Commentators framed it as a twist, a betrayal of expectations, and the public followed, drawn by the promise of revelation. Yet with every new angle came new fatigue. The appetite for complexity waned, replaced by demands for clarity that the case could not yet provide. In that tension, investigators felt the risk of narrative collapse, the moment when too many possibilities render all of them unbelievable. Behind closed doors, they debated strategy late into the night. Should they press harder on the adjacent figure, risk spooking them into silence? Should they challenge the confession more aggressively, knowing it might be withdrawn entirely? Or should they step back, let time work, allow pressure to accumulate without overt force? There were no right answers, only trade-offs, and every decision felt like it could tip the balance toward resolution or ruin. A small but telling development arrived quietly, a correction to a long-accepted fact about the victim's last known movements. A receipt, misdated for decades, placed them in a different location shortly before the crime, one that intersected with the adjacent figure's routine but not with the confessor's account. The correction was subtle, almost trivial, but its implications rippled outward, undermining assumptions that had survived multiple reviews. It suggested an encounter unaccounted for, a moment of contact that had slipped through the cracks of memory and record alike. When this was presented, reactions diverged sharply. The adjacent figure struggled to reconcile the new information with their previous statements, offering explanations that grew increasingly complex. The confessor dismissed it as irrelevant, an error blown out of proportion. Detectives listened, noted, compared, and felt the shape of the case shifting again, less like a straight line and more like a knot, tight and resistant, each pull revealing another tangle. As the year edged forward, the investigation entered a phase defined less by discovery than by endurance. Progress was measured in millimeters, not leaps. Morale ebbed and flowed with each small gain and setback. Yet there was a sense, hard to articulate but widely shared, that the case was closer to its core than it had ever been. The layers added over decades were thinning, assumptions shedding under sustained pressure, and what remained was raw, uncomfortable, and unresolved. In the end, Part 5 closed without answers, but with something arguably more valuable, a clearer understanding of what the case was not. It was not a single act explained by a single voice. It was not a mystery waiting for the right confession to unlock it. It was a convergence of people, routines, and moments, all colliding in a narrow slice of time that had been misunderstood for far too long. And as investigators prepared to push further, they did so knowing that the truth, when it finally emerged, would not offer the neat satisfaction so many were waiting for, but a reckoning with how easily certainty can be manufactured and how hard it is to dismantle once believed. By now the case had stopped behaving like a problem to be solved and started acting like a living thing, reacting to pressure, withdrawing when cornered, reshaping itself just enough to survive. Investigators felt it in their bones. Every time they thought they understood its outline, another contour emerged, another shadow where certainty should have been. The focus shifted again, not dramatically, not with announcements or raids, but with a quiet recalibration of priorities. Instead of chasing what might have happened, they began asking why the truth had resisted them for so long, what forces had kept it obscured even as technology and persistence closed in. They revisited institutional decisions from 1987, not to assign blame, but to understand momentum. Early assumptions had guided resource allocation, and resource allocation had shaped outcomes. Certain avenues were explored aggressively, others barely at all. The confession, arriving decades later, had slipped neatly into one of those neglected spaces, offering a sense of completion without challenging the original framework. That realization was uncomfortable. It suggested the case hadn't gone cold because it was insoluble, but because it had been allowed to cool, slowly, under the weight of its own narrative. The adjacent figure's history was mapped with renewed intensity, not just movements and contacts, but emotional context. relationships, grievances, patterns of behavior that didn't show up on records. People who had known them in the late 80s spoke cautiously, aware of how memory could be weaponized, but certain themes repeated. A tendency to insert themselves into situations. A desire to be useful, indispensable. A discomfort with being excluded. None of it criminal. All of it human. And yet, when placed alongside opportunity and access, it formed a psychological profile that demanded attention. At the same time, the victim's inner life, long overshadowed by circumstance, was brought back into focus. Diaries were reread, not for clues, but for tone. Letters were analyzed for subtext. Friends were asked questions they'd never been asked before, about fears dismissed at the time as anxiety, about routines altered without explanation. A picture emerged of someone navigating quiet pressures, obligations that weren't fully understood even by those closest to them. The idea that the crime had been random began to erode, replaced by the possibility of inevitability, a convergence driven by relationships rather than chance. The confessor, sensing his role diminishing, made a calculated move. Through intermediaries, he signaled a willingness to provide more detail, to clarify points that had previously been vague, but only under specific conditions. The offer was tempting. More information was always valuable. But conditions were red flags, suggesting negotiation rather than remorse. Detectives debated the ethics and efficacy of engaging, aware that any new statement could contaminate the evidentiary pool as easily as enrich it. In the end, they agreed to listen but not to concede. What followed was a carefully staged interaction, every word recorded, every pause noted. The confessor expanded on his original account, adding color, emotion, moments of regret that had been absent before. He spoke of fear, of panic, of consequences spiraling beyond control. It was compelling. Too compelling. The additions aligned suspiciously well with public discourse, addressing criticisms that had circulated in media and online. It felt reactive, adaptive, a story evolving in response to scrutiny. Detectives left the room with the same uneasy conclusion. The confession was becoming less reliable the more it tried to be complete. Meanwhile, a separate thread quietly gained strength. Transport data, once too fragmented to matter, was reanalyzed using modern modeling. Patterns emerged that hadn't been visible before, suggesting synchronized movements that were statistically unlikely to be coincidental. The adjacent figure's routine overlapped with the victim's in subtle ways, not daily, not predictably, but often enough to matter. It implied awareness, an understanding of windows of opportunity that could only come from familiarity. This wasn't proof of guilt, but it was proof of knowledge, and knowledge narrowed the field. The investigation's emotional toll deepened. Detectives found themselves dreaming about the case, replaying interviews in their sleep, second-guessing instincts honed over careers. Younger officers, who had grown up after the crime, struggled with the weight of its history, the sense that they were arguing with ghosts. Older ones felt the pressure of time more acutely, aware that this might be their last chance to see resolution. The case became a mirror, reflecting not just a crime, but the limits of certainty, the cost of delay. Public discourse fractured further. Some clung to the confession as a lifeline, unwilling to accept ambiguity after so many years. Others embraced the new complexity, convinced the truth had been hidden in plain sight. The victim's family watched these debates with quiet exhaustion, their grief dissected by strangers who mistook speculation for insight. They were consulted again, asked to weigh in on decisions that no one should have to make, and their responses were measured, restrained, shaped by decades of disappointment. A turning point arrived not with a revelation, but with a refusal. When asked to account for a specific discrepancy highlighted by the transport analysis, the adjacent figure declined to answer, citing legal advice. It was their right. It was also their loudest statement yet. Silence, in this context, carried weight, not as an admission, but as a boundary, a signal that the inquiry was now touching something sensitive. Detectives noted it carefully, resisting the urge to read too much into it, even as they understood its significance. As winter deepened, The case entered a fragile phase. Momentum existed, but so did risk. One misstep could collapse trust, taint evidence, or harden positions beyond negotiation. The investigation slowed deliberately, focusing on consolidation rather than expansion, ensuring that every conclusion was supported, every inference defensible. It was painstaking work, the kind that rarely makes headlines, but it was necessary. The truth, if it was to surface, would need a stable foundation. And through it all, the echo of 1987 persisted, a reminder that the crime itself had been brief, almost mundane in its execution, while its consequences stretched across generations. The unanswered call, the quiet flat, the city that moved on too quickly, all of it converged in the present, demanding reckoning. Part 6 closed with the case balanced on a knife edge, no longer dormant, not yet resolved, its final shape still obscured, waiting for the moment when pressure, patience, and chance would finally align. The knife edge held, but it did not stay still. It vibrated under forces no one fully controlled: legal pressure, public expectation, personal fatigue, and the quiet, corrosive effect of time running out. Investigators sensed that whatever came next would not arrive as a revelation shouted across a room, but as a subtle shift, a change in resistance when they pressed on familiar ground. They began to notice it in small things, in how answers were phrased, in which details people volunteered unprompted and which had to be dragged into the light. Attention returned once more to the hours after the crime, not the act itself, but the wake it left behind. Who spoke to whom? Who cleaned what? Who asked questions too early or not at all? In 1987, the assumption had been that panic followed violence. Now, with distance, it was clear that calm had followed instead, a controlled sequence of actions that suggested planning without appearing planned. The flat had not been scrubbed, but it had been managed. Disorder existed, but only where it could be explained away. It was the kind of restraint that came from familiarity, from knowing exactly how much chaos a scene could absorb before it started asking questions. This reframing cast new light on early police activity. Officers had noted nothing overtly suspicious in the immediate aftermath, a fact long cited as evidence of a spontaneous act. Now it read differently. If the scene had been curated, subtly, then its apparent normality was the point. The radio playing, the door locked, the body positioned not to shock but to be found. These were not dramatic choices. They were practical ones, made by someone who understood how scenes were interpreted. The adjacent figure's behavior in the days following the crime was revisited with this lens. They had checked in, offered help, asked after progress. Actions that once read as concern now felt ambiguous, hovering between empathy and surveillance. Their presence had been constant but unobtrusive, the kind that leaves no obvious trace. Detectives noted how often they appeared at the edges of key moments, not central, never dominant, but always nearby. Proximity, it seemed, had been their defining characteristic. At the same time, the confessor's post-crime behavior was examined more critically. Records showed no visible unraveling, no sudden changes that might accompany guilt or trauma. Life continued. Work continued. Relationships continued. It was not impossible, but it was inconsistent with the narrative he had begun to tell, one of panic and irreversible mistake. The gap between his words and his actions widened under scrutiny, and that gap became impossible to ignore. A new set of interviews was authorized, narrower and more focused than before. Questions were designed not to elicit stories, but reactions. Timelines were presented out of order. Details were challenged indirectly. Investigators watched for hesitation, for recalibration, for the instinctive corrections that betray deeper knowledge. In these sessions, the adjacent figure grew visibly strained, composure slipping just enough to be noticed. The confessor, by contrast, remained composed, almost detached, his emotional responses appearing on cue, then fading just as quickly. One interview, conducted late in the evening, shifted something intangible but profound. Asked about a seemingly irrelevant object from the flat, something never mentioned publicly, The adjacent figure responded too quickly, naming its location with precision. The mistake was minor. It could be explained, but it lodged in the room like a splinter. Knowledge reveals itself not only in what is said, but in how easily it is accessed, and this detail had been too close, too ready. From that moment on, the investigation took on a different tone. Less speculative, more deliberate. Pieces that had felt loosely connected began to cluster. Not into certainty, but into plausibility. The question was no longer whether the adjacent figure might have been involved, but in what capacity, and whether that involvement could ever be demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt. The confession loomed over the shift, both obstacle and opportunity, a narrative that could be used to mask deeper truths or to expose them, depending on how it was handled. Legal strategy adjusted accordingly. Prosecutors emphasized the importance of corroboration, of building a case that could survive not just trial, but the public reckoning that would follow. The risk of pursuing the wrong resolution weighed heavily. A failed prosecution would not just close the case again, it would calcify doubt permanently. The burden of getting it right, after getting it wrong for so long, was immense. Public discourse, sensing movement, sharpened. Language shifted from speculation to anticipation. Commentators spoke of breakthroughs without evidence, of imminent arrests that never came. Each false expectation eroded trust, and investigators felt the walls closing in, not from guilt, but from impatience. The case demanded time, but time was the one thing it was no longer being granted. The victim's family was informed, carefully, of the new direction. Not of conclusions, but of focus. The conversation was heavy, words chosen with precision, acknowledging both progress and uncertainty. Their response was quiet, measured, a reflection of years spent managing hope. They asked one question that cut through everything else, not who, not how, but whether the truth would ever be known, even if the law could not name it. No one answered directly. As spring approached, the investigation stood at a threshold. Evidence had not crystallized, but it had aligned. The shape of the night in 1987 felt closer, its contours sharper, its silences louder. The city outside continued its indifferent rhythm, unaware of how close the past was to intruding again. And within the case, a realization settled, heavy and unavoidable. The ending, when it came, would not be delivered by confession or technology alone, but by a fragile synthesis of memory, motive, and moment, and even then, it might only approximate the truth. Part 7 closed with that understanding hanging in the air, the sense that the case was no longer asking to be solved, but to be interpreted, its meaning as contested as its facts, its resolution dependent not just on what could be proven, but on what could finally be believed. The shift from interpretation to implication was almost imperceptible, but once it happened, there was no going back. Investigators stopped asking what might have happened and started asking what could be demonstrated, a colder, narrower question that stripped the case of romance and left only friction. Evidence was no longer gathered to illuminate the past, but to survive the future, cross-examination, appeal, public skepticism. The case hardened, not into certainty, but into shape. They focused on sequence again, not the broad sweep of the night, but it seems the moments where one action ended and another began. Entry, presence, exit. What had always troubled them now became central, the absence of interruption. No neighbor hearing raised voices. No sudden noise that demanded attention. That kind of silence was not luck. It was compatibility. Whoever had been there fit into the space, into the hour, into the victim's expectations. Violence had arrived disguised as normality. That understanding elevated the importance of trust. Not dramatic trust, not intimacy necessarily, but enough familiarity to lower defenses. Investigators cataloged everyone who possessed it, then eliminated those whose timelines, temperaments, or histories made them implausible. The list shrank. Predictably, uncomfortably, the adjacent figure remained, stubbornly, at its center. A behavioral analyst was brought in, not to profile a killer in the abstract, but to read the investigation itself, to assess where resistance was strongest and why. Their conclusion unsettled the room. The case, they argued, showed signs of narrative displacement, a truth too close to be faced directly, repeatedly diverted into safer explanations. The confession, in this reading, was not an intrusion, but a release valve, a way for the system to exhale without confronting its own blind spots. It was a theory, not evidence, but it resonated. Re-interviews intensified. This time, questions were blunt. Not accusatory, but unavoidably pointed. When asked why certain details had never been volunteered, the adjacent figures cited irrelevance, oversight, the fog of memory. Reasonable answers. Too reasonable. Each one smoothed the surface without addressing what lay beneath. Detectives noted the pattern: defensiveness masked as cooperation, control disguised as helpfulness. Then came the material detail that refused to settle. A trace, insignificant on its own, but persistent. It appeared in multiple places it should not have been, connecting environments that were meant to be separate. Not conclusive, not clean, but repeatable. Analysts argued over contamination, over secondary transfer, over coincidence stretched thin. The debate was technical, precise, exhausting. And in the end, it resolved into an uncomfortable truth. The trace could be explained away, but not easily, and not without effort. The confessor was confronted with this development indirectly, his response measured against previous reactions. He dismissed it with practiced skepticism, questioned its validity, reframed it as investigative desperation. It was a defensible position. It was also telling. He showed more interest in the mechanics of doubt than in the substance of the finding, more concern with how uncertainty could be leveraged than with what certainty might reveal. Behind closed doors, prosecutors grew cautious. The case, they agreed, was strong in implication and weak in isolation. Each piece made sense in relation to others, but none stood tall alone. Juries, they knew, struggled with that kind of truth. They wanted anchors. They wanted moments. They wanted certainty delivered whole. What this case offered instead was convergence, persuasive but fragile. The risk of collapse loomed larger than ever. If the confession were formally discredited, it could take years of work with it. If it were accepted uncritically, it could bury the deeper truth permanently. The investigation walked a narrowing path between those outcomes, every step deliberate, every decision freighted with consequence. The victim's family was updated again, this time with less ceremony. There was no point in cushioning reality. They were told the truth was closer than ever, and farther than it looked. That resolution might come without a verdict. That answers might arrive incomplete. Their reaction was not anger, but something quieter and harder to bear: recognition. They had lived inside that ambiguity for decades. It was the rest of the world that was only now catching up. As summer approached, pressure from above intensified. Budgets were questioned. Timelines scrutinized. The unspoken question surfaced in meetings that ended too quickly. When was enough? Enough? Investigators resisted, not out of pride, but because stopping now would freeze the case in its most distorted form, halfway between revelation and retreat. If it was to end, it had to end honestly. One final reanalysis was authorized, a synthesis of everything collected since reopening, stripped of hierarchy. No primary theory. No favored narrative. Just data, aligned and examined for emergent patterns. What emerged was not a smoking gun, but a silhouette, consistent, persistent, difficult to ignore. It did not point cleanly to one person acting alone, nor to one moment of chaos, but to a quiet collaboration between circumstance and intent, between someone who acted and someone who enabled. As Part 8 closed, the case stood on the brink of articulation. Not resolution. Articulation. The ability to say, with clarity and restraint, what likely happened, and why proving it might always fall just short of justice. The cold case was no longer frozen. It was unstable, thawing unevenly, revealing fragments that challenged simple endings. And in that instability lay its final danger: the possibility that the truth, once visible, would still slip through the fingers of the system built to hold it. The silhouette, once seen, could not be unseen. It hovered over every document, every transcript, every grainy photograph from 1987, a shape formed not by a single act but by alignment, by the way lives brushed against each other until friction became force. Investigators spoke less now, words conserved, energy directed inward, because the case had reached a point where talking too much risked distorting what little clarity had been gained. This was the phase where restraint mattered more than pursuit, where the temptation to force an ending had to be resisted. They began drafting internally, not charges, not announcements, but a narrative memo, an exercise in intellectual honesty rather than legal ambition. It asked a simple, brutal question. If this case were not bound by courtroom standards, what would it say? The answer unfolded slowly, line by line, a reconstruction built from probability and behavior rather than confession or proof. It described a night shaped by familiarity, a presence that did not alarm, an encounter that escalated quietly, and an aftermath managed rather than fled. It did not name a villain. It outlined roles. In this version, the confessor existed not as a protagonist, but as a buffer, someone whose story absorbed attention, whose admissions simplified chaos into something digestible. Whether intentional or not, his confession had functioned as insulation, protecting the more uncomfortable truth from exposure. The adjacent figure, in turn, occupied a space of plausible deniability, close enough to matter, distant enough to deflect. Between them lay the crime itself, stripped of myth, reduced to a sequence of choices made under pressure. This internal clarity sharpened external frustration. Prosecutors, presented with the memo, acknowledged its coherence and rejected its utility. It was compelling, they said, but not actionable. Too much inference. Too little isolation. The legal threshold remained unmoved, indifferent to nuance. The system, designed to punish certainty, could not accommodate likelihood, no matter how persuasive. It was a familiar impasse, but this time it landed harder, because the shape of the truth felt so near. The confessor, sensing the investigation's recalibration, made one last attempt to reclaim center stage. Through counsel, he floated the possibility of a formal plea, conditional, limited, designed to close the case without trial. It was an offer framed as mercy, for the family, for the city, for everyone exhausted by waiting. Detectives recognized it for what it was, an attempt to lock the narrative before it could evolve further. Accepting it would mean answers of a kind. Rejecting it would mean prolonging uncertainty indefinitely. The debate was fierce and unresolved. Some argued that an imperfect ending was better than none, that a name on paper mattered more than an unprovable truth. Others countered that cementing the wrong story would be a second crime, one committed with full awareness. The victim's family was consulted again, placed in an impossible position, asked to choose between closure and accuracy. They did not give an answer. They asked for time. While the system hesitated, the adjacent figure withdrew further, legal walls rising higher, cooperation thinning to formal compliance. Their silence grew heavier, not because it implied guilt, but because it confirmed relevance. People irrelevant to truth do not need such careful boundaries. The investigation logged this change without commentary, aware that observation was all that remained. Media narratives began to fracture. Some outlets framed the lack of charges as failure, others as cover-up, still others as tragic inevitability. The phrase cold case reappeared with a new inflection, less about age, more about temperature, the sense that the truth was visible but untouchable, like ice beneath clear water. Public interest waned and flared in cycles, attention drifting, then snapping back with each rumor of movement. Inside the team, something shifted emotionally. The urgency that had driven reopening gave way to resolve, quieter but more durable. They were no longer chasing justice as an outcome, but as a process, determined that whatever the case became, it would not revert to myth. Records were annotated meticulously, decisions documented, assumptions flagged. If the truth could not be prosecuted, it could at least be preserved, protected from future distortion. The victim's family returned with their answer. They did not want a plea that felt incomplete. They did not want a confession that solved nothing. They wanted the investigation to continue as long as it could do so honestly, and to end only when it had reached its natural limit. It was not forgiveness. It was not resignation. It was clarity, and it carried weight. With that, the path narrowed further. The plea was declined. The case pressed on, not toward trial, but toward articulation, toward a final report that would say what could be said and acknowledge what could not. This was not the ending anyone had imagined when the confession first broke the silence. There would be no dramatic arrest, no gavel striking, no definitive answer delivered cleanly to the public. As Part 9 closed, the investigation stood in its most precarious position yet. The truth felt present, almost audible, but the structures meant to contain it were proving inadequate. The cold case, reopened with the promise of resolution, now confronted a deeper question: whether justice required certainty, or whether, in rare and brutal cases, it could exist only as an honest accounting of what likely happened and why proving it had become impossible. The final phase did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, disguised as paperwork, as meetings that ran a little longer than scheduled, as sentences rewritten again and again to remove certainty where none could be defended. The investigation had crossed an invisible line, from pursuit to preservation, from trying to win a case to trying not to lose the truth entirely. This was where cold cases often ended, not with answers, but with decisions about how much ambiguity the system could tolerate without breaking faith with the dead. The report grew dense, deliberate, resistant to simplification. Every claim was paired with its limitation, every inference anchored to evidence, and immediately checked against alternative explanations. It was an act of discipline, almost defiance, refusing the seduction of a clean story. The silhouette remained central, described not as an accusation but as an alignment of probabilities that could not be ignored without willful blindness. It acknowledged the confession, not as resolution, but as disruption, a force that altered the investigation without resolving it. Language mattered, now more than ever. Words like likely and consistent with replaced did and was. Responsibility was discussed without assigning guilt. Roles were outlined without names attached. It was not evasion. It was precision. The investigators knew that this document might become the last authoritative account of the case, referenced long after they were gone, and they refused to let it lie. The confessor was informed of the direction things were taking. There would be no plea, no closure by concession. His confession would remain part of the record, scrutinized, contextualized, neither embraced nor dismissed. He reacted with frustration thinly veiled as disappointment, warning that without acceptance, the case would drift back into uncertainty. Detectives listened without responding. They understood now that certainty offered under conditions was not certainty at all. The adjacent figure was given the same courtesy, notified formally that the investigation had reached its evidentiary limit. No charges would be filed at this time. The phrasing was careful, non-exculpatory. It did not clear them. It did not accuse them. It simply acknowledged reality. Their response was minimal, relief and tension braided together, a boundary maintained to the end. The silence that followed felt heavier than any denial. When word began to leak, as it always does, the reaction was swift and polarized. Some accused the investigators of cowardice, of hiding behind nuance to avoid hard decisions. Others praised the restraint, the refusal to manufacture justice where it could not be proven. The city argued with itself again, old habits resurfacing, impatience clashing with doubt. Headlines softened, then sharpened, then faded. The story refused to behave. The victim's family received the report in person. It was not a presentation. It was a handover. They were given time, privacy, and honesty. The document did not tell them who to blame. It told them what was known, what was suspected, and what would likely never be recovered from the past. It acknowledged failure without apologizing for it. Their reaction was private, But those present would later describe it as quiet recognition rather than acceptance, an understanding that the truth they sought did not live in verdicts alone. As the report moved through official channels, it became something else, a reference point, a boundary marker. Future inquiries would have to reckon with it. Future confessions would be measured against it. The case could be reopened again, but it would not be reset. The myths that had grown around it were cut back, replaced by a harder, less satisfying account. The night in 1987 was no longer a blank space. It was a contested one. For the investigators, the end was anticlimactic. Desks were cleared, files archived, lives resumed. But the case lingered, not as obsession, but as a recalibration of belief. It had taught them that truth was not always a destination, but sometimes a limit, the furthest point you could reach without lying to yourself. That lesson stayed with them, shaping how they approached every case that followed. London absorbed the outcome the way it absorbs everything, unevenly, selectively. Some remembered. Most moved on. The street where it happened continued its routines, footsteps echoing where others once had, radios playing, doors opening and closing without ceremony. The city did not resolve the case. It lived around it. As Part 10 drew to a close, the cold case existed in a state more unsettling than ignorance. It had been seen clearly enough to know its contours, but not clearly enough to name its center. The confession had not ended the mystery. It had exposed its depth. And in that exposure lay the final discomfort, that the truth, once approached honestly, did not always arrive as an answer, but as a boundary, a place where knowing ends and responsibility begins. The case did not end so much as it receded, pulling back into the city the way fog slips into side streets, still present, just no longer visible from a distance. Officially, it rested. Unofficially, it lived on in margins, in footnotes, in conversations that began with certainty and ended in pause. The report existed now, solid and unsatisfying, a document that refused to close the door even as it acknowledged there was nowhere left to walk. It did not declare the mystery solved. It declared it understood as far as it could be. Time resumed its work. The confession lost its urgency, becoming one element among many, no longer the headline, no longer the promise it had once seemed to be. The adjacent figure faded from view, protected by the absence of charges and the passage of years, their life continuing in the way most lives do, quietly, without ceremony. The confessor remained, tethered to his own words, neither vindicated nor condemned, a man defined by a truth he could not fully prove and could not escape. Both occupied an uneasy space in the story, neither center nor footnote, reminders that proximity to truth does not guarantee ownership of it. For the victim's family, the end came without punctuation. No verdict to mark a date. No sentence to measure time against. Just an accumulation of understanding that settled slowly, reshaping grief into something less volatile, but no less heavy. They returned to private remembrance, carrying with them not answers, but context, a clearer sense of how the night unfolded and why it had resisted explanation. It was not peace. It was orientation. The city moved on, as cities always do, but it carried traces. The street changed names. The takeaway closed. The flat was renovated again, walls repainted, floors replaced, the past sealed beneath new surfaces. And yet, the rhythm of the place remained, footsteps on stairs, radios murmuring in the dark, the ordinary sounds that had framed an extraordinary absence. Somewhere nearby, a payphone was removed entirely, its place taken by nothing at all, a gap that felt symbolic only in hindsight. Occasionally, the case resurfaced. A documentary, a podcast, an article written by someone too young to remember 1987 but old enough to feel its weight. Each retelling simplified and complicated in equal measure, drawn to the confession, intrigued by its failure to conclude. The silhouette described in the report became shorthand among those who studied the case, a way to talk about responsibility without naming it. It frustrated audiences looking for villains. It satisfied those who understood that some truths resist that shape. Within policing circles, the case became a cautionary reference, cited quietly in training rooms and closed-door discussions. Not as a failure, but as a boundary. It illustrated how easily early assumptions could harden into obstacles, how narratives, once established, could steer investigations as powerfully as evidence. It reminded those who listened that reopening a cold case was not about resurrection, but reckoning with the past, with the present, and with the limits of proof. The investigators involved rarely spoke of it publicly. When they did, their language was careful, restrained, shaped by years of reflection. They did not claim justice. They claimed honesty. They spoke of alignment rather than certainty, of responsibility rather than guilt. It was not a message designed to comfort, but it was one designed to endure. And so the case settled into its final form, not solved, not forgotten, but integrated into the city's long memory, a quiet pressure beneath the surface. The confession that once promised an ending remained what it had always been, a disruption, a catalyst, a reminder that answers offered too neatly should be examined most closely. The cold case had been reopened, not to be closed again, but to be seen clearly, its edges defined, its center left intentionally unfilled. In the end, what lingered was not the violence, but the restraint, the understanding that truth is not always a destination reached by force, but a boundary approached by patience. The unanswered call, the managed silence, the familiar presence that did not alarm until it was too late, these details remained, circulating quietly through the story, immune to resolution. London absorbed them the way it absorbs everything, unevenly, imperfectly, carrying on while never entirely letting go. The mystery did not end with a confession. It ended with a recognition, shared but rarely spoken, that some crimes leave behind not answers, but questions refined to their sharpest point. And in that recognition, in the space where certainty failed but honesty remained, the cold case found its final, unsettling resting place. The story should have ended there, and for a time it almost did. The report settled into archives. The headlines aged out of search results. The city found newer shocks to absorb. But cold cases do not truly rest. They hibernate, waiting for conditions to change. And conditions always change, slowly, quietly, without asking permission. It began with a detail so small it would have been ignored in any other context, a routine audit of preserved evidence prompted not by this case, but by a different one. Another unsolved death with superficial similarities. A technician noticed a labeling inconsistency, a box logged under an outdated system, its contents transferred twice over decades, surviving more by luck than design. Inside were items long assumed exhausted of value, inert relics from a time before certainty could be extracted from dust. They were not reopened with expectation, only with obligation. Technology had advanced again, not dramatically, not with promises of miracles, but incrementally, enough to make the impossible merely difficult. The samples were reprocessed under new protocols, contamination accounted for in ways that had not existed before. The results did not shout. They whispered. They did not contradict the report. They complicated it. A pattern emerged that did not point cleanly to any single person, but it did narrow the field in an unexpected way. It suggested proximity at a level previously unprovable, a physical overlap that aligned more closely with one life than another. The silhouette shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Not enough to reopen proceedings. Not enough to name. But enough to confirm that the truth had not been static, only waiting. The finding was reviewed, challenged, verified again. It survived scrutiny, but it did not survive ambition. Prosecutors acknowledged it with careful language, noting its significance and its limits in the same breath. It strengthened the report without transforming it. It edged the understanding closer without delivering it across the threshold. The law remained unmoved, and perhaps rightly so. Evidence that arrives too late often does. The investigators who received the update reacted not with excitement, but with recognition. This was the shape they had sensed, now outlined more clearly. It did not change the ending. It validated the journey. For some, that was enough. For others, it reopened old wounds, the frustration sharpened by confirmation that they had been circling the truth all along, constrained not by blindness, but by time. The victim's family was informed again, gently, with fewer words than before. They listened, asked precise questions, absorbed the implications. The new information did not give them answers, but it gave them reassurance that the case had not stalled because it was empty, but because it was full, too full to be carried by a single conclusion. Their response was subdued, almost serene, a reflection not of closure, but of endurance. The confessor was never formally confronted with the update. There was no procedural necessity, no legal advantage. But the knowledge reached him anyway, as knowledge always does. Through rumor, through implication, through silence where certainty had once been offered. Those close to him noticed a change, a tightening, a retreat from the narrative he had once tried to own. The story no longer belonged to him, if it ever had. The adjacent figure, too, sensed the shift. There were no accusations, no summons, no public reckoning. Just a quiet recalibration in how the case was spoken about, how certain absences were now interpreted. The law did not move against them. History, however, had already begun to. Years passed. The city continued its cycles. New crimes eclipsed old ones. New technologies promised clarity, then delivered complexity. The case appeared occasionally in academic journals, in discussions about investigative bias, about the limits of confession, about how systems respond when truth resists closure. It became less a story and more a reference, a framework for understanding how justice behaves at its edges. In that space, the case took on a different kind of life. Not sensational, not resolved, but instructive. It taught that reopening a cold case is not an act of resurrection, but of confrontation, with assumptions, with patience, with the possibility that truth may arrive fragmented and late. It taught that certainty is not the same as honesty, and that restraint can be a form of respect. London, indifferent as ever, carried the memory without ceremony. People walked the street without knowing its history, or knowing it only vaguely, as one knows the outlines of a rumor. Radios still played at night. Doors still closed softly. The city did not memorialize the crime. It incorporated it, the way it incorporates everything into its background noise. And somewhere in the archive, the case rested again, not frozen this time, but tempered. Its edges worn smooth by scrutiny. Its core still intact. It waited, not for a miracle, but for understanding, for the slow accumulation of insight that might one day tip probability into proof, or might not. The final truth, whatever its precise configuration, no longer needed to be shouted. It existed in alignment, in consistency, in the narrowing of doubt. It existed in the shared recognition among those who had looked closely enough that the night in 1987 had not been random, not chaotic, not inexplicable. It had been quiet, familiar, managed, and that understanding, unsettling as it was, had survived every attempt to erase it. Cold cases are often described as frozen in time, but this one was never still. It moved, slowly, through memory, through method, through restraint. It changed the people who touched it, asked things of them they could not easily give, and in return offered no clean reward. Only clarity, without certainty. Only truth without verdict. And perhaps that was its final act. Not to be solved, but to remain. A reminder that some mysteries do not end with answers, but with a sharpened awareness of how fragile truth can be, and how carefully it must be handled once found. The case no longer belonged to any one moment, any one person, or even any one generation. By the time it reached what some quietly called its 13th life, it had become something closer to a pressure system than a story, influencing how other cases were approached, how confessions were weighed, how silence was interpreted. It was cited without being named, referenced in footnotes and training materials as an example of what happens when certainty arrives before understanding and what it costs to untangle them later. A young investigator encountered it for the first time not through headlines or documentaries, but through an internal seminar, a slide showing a timeline riddled with gaps and annotations. They noticed what others had come to accept, how early confidence had narrowed vision, how the most disruptive element had been the one that felt most helpful. The confession. It stood there like a monument to resolution, impressive, misleading, casting a shadow longer than anyone expected. The lesson was not that confessions lie, but that they persuade, and persuasion can be more dangerous than deception. That investigator asked a question that lingered after the room emptied, not about guilt or innocence, but about responsibility. Who is responsible when the truth is distributed across actions that never quite cross into crime on their own? When harm is enabled rather than delivered? When presence matters more than force? The answer, offered quietly, was unsatisfying and honest. Responsibility does not always condense into a single name. Sometimes it remains a pattern. Outside institutional walls, the case continued its quiet circulation. Someone who had lived on the street in 1987 recognized a detail in a late-night radio segment and felt a chill they couldn't explain. Someone else remembered a face they had dismissed decades earlier and wondered, briefly, if memory itself could be a witness. These moments did not coalesce into action. They dissipated, like breath in cold air. But they added to the case's gravity, the sense that it was still exerting force, however faint. The confessor aged into obscurity, his earlier certainty eroded by time and contradiction. He stopped offering explanations, stopped defending his version. Those who knew him noticed how carefully he avoided the past, how the story he once seemed eager to own had become something he no longer wanted touched. His silence was not an admission. It was a retreat, and retreats, too, leave traces. The adjacent figure remained untouched by law, but not by consequence. Their name never appeared in charges, but it surfaced in conversations framed carefully, hypothetically, among those who understood the case's contours. History had a way of reassigning weight, even when institutions could not. Nothing public shifted. Everything subtle did. For the family, time softened nothing, but it clarified much. They learned how to live alongside a truth that had edges but no center, a shape they could hold without being able to point to its heart. They stopped waiting for announcements. They stopped marking anniversaries by what might happen. Instead, they marked them by what had been learned, by how far the understanding had traveled from that first night of shock and silence. The city absorbed this phase as it had absorbed all the others. Indifferently. Completely. New buildings rose. Old ones vanished. The soundscape changed. What remained constant was the way the city carried unresolved things without acknowledging them, layering present over past until only those who listened closely could hear what lay beneath. In quiet professional circles, the case earned a final description, never official, never written down, but repeated often enough to endure. It was called a solved unsolved case. Not because the answer was known, but because the question had been refined to its purest form. What happened was no longer a mystery. What could be proven always would be. And that distinction mattered. Because in the end, the case did not ask to be closed. It asked to be remembered accurately. To resist simplification. To stand as evidence that truth is not always a revelation. Sometimes it is a discipline, maintained through restraint, through refusal, through the courage to stop short of certainty rather than step beyond honesty. The cold case did not end with justice delivered or denied. It ended with something rarer and more uncomfortable. Clarity, without consolation. A shared understanding that the night in 1987 was not an aberration, but a convergence of trust, access, timing, and silence. That no single moment explained it, and no single voice ever could. And so it remained, not frozen, not resolved, but awake, a low hum beneath the city's noise, reminding anyone willing to listen that some mysteries are not meant to be finished, only understood well enough not to be repeated. By its 14th telling, the case had shed even the illusion of movement. There were no more breakthroughs to anticipate, no dormant evidence waiting for the right machine or the right mind. What remained was inertia, not stagnation, but a steady, enduring presence, like a landmark everyone navigated around without ever quite seeing. The case had stopped asking questions of investigators and begun asking them of the system itself, of memory, of how societies decide when knowing is enough. The file was still accessed, quietly, by those who felt its pull. Not because they expected revelation, but because it offered orientation. It reminded them what restraint looked like under pressure, how easy it was to mistake narrative for truth, how often the most dangerous answers were the ones that arrived early and spoke confidently. In this way, the case continued to work, long after active investigation had ceased, shaping instincts rather than outcomes. A historian examining late 20th century policing patterns paused over it, struck not by what was missing, but by what remained intact across decades of reinterpretation. Names changed. Technologies evolved. Public language softened and sharpened again. But the core alignment held. Familiarity without alarm. Access without force. Silence without chaos. The historian noted how rare it was for a case to survive that many retellings without collapsing into fiction, and how telling it was that this one resisted myth so stubbornly. In the public imagination, the confession had become a footnote rather than a conclusion, its initial shock dulled by time and analysis. Younger audiences, encountering the story without the emotional context of its unveiling, saw it differently. To them, it was less a revelation than a distraction, an early answer that failed to age well. They were drawn instead to the quieter elements, the managed scene, the overlapping routines, the way the crimes seemed to slide into place rather than explode. Their questions were sharper, less invested in blame, more interested in mechanism. The adjacent figure was rarely mentioned by name now, when mentioned at all. Their role existed more as a concept than a person, an illustration of proximity and enablement rather than a suspect. This abstraction did not erase responsibility, but it redistributed it, forcing uncomfortable discussions about how harm can occur without a single, decisive act. It unsettled those who preferred villains clearly defined and endings clearly marked. For the family, the case entered a final phase of intimacy. It was no longer something that happened to them in public. It was something they carried privately, informed by years of attention and retreat. They had learned which details mattered and which did not, which debates were noise and which reflected genuine understanding. They chose silence more often than not out of resignation but out of ownership. The story no longer belonged to commentators or institutions. It belonged to memory. London continued, indifferent and complete. The city's genius had always been its ability to contain contradiction, to hold unresolved histories without collapsing under their weight. This case became one more layer in that palimpsest, written over but never fully erased. Those who walked the streets rarely sensed it. Those who did felt it only briefly, a momentary pressure, a reminder that the ground beneath them held more than foundations. In professional circles, the phrase solved unsolved case endured, but its meaning evolved. It no longer described an outcome, but a posture, a way of standing with uncertainty without surrendering rigor. It became shorthand for an ethic, a refusal to force closure where it could not be earned. New cases were measured against it, not to replicate its trajectory, but to avoid its early missteps. And so the cold case reached its quiet coda, not an ending, but a settling. It had done what few cases managed to do. It had changed how people thought. About evidence. About confession. About silence. About the difference between explanation and truth. Its legacy was not resolution, but calibration, a finer sense of where certainty ends and responsibility begins. There was no final announcement. No last word. Just the slow integration of its lessons into practice and memory. The night in 1987 remained what it had always been, brief, ordinary, devastating. What followed stretched far longer, shaped by effort, doubt, and restraint. And in that long aftermath, the case found its final form, not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as a reminder that some truths, once approached honestly, ask only to be held carefully and never, ever simplified. By the 15th movement, the case had reached something like equilibrium. Not peace, not closure, but balance, a steady state where nothing new was expected and nothing old was dismissed. It existed now less as an event than as a reference point, a gravity well in the collective memory of those who had followed it closely enough to be changed by it. The story no longer advanced. It deepened. What endured was not the crime itself, but the discipline it demanded. The refusal to rush. The insistence on proportion. The understanding that truth could be asymmetrical, heavier on one side, incomplete on the other, and still worth defending. In quiet ways, this discipline filtered outward, shaping how investigators approached ambiguity, how journalists framed uncertainty, how audiences learned, slowly, to tolerate discomfort without demanding spectacle. Occasionally, someone new would encounter the case and ask the question everyone asked at first, the one that felt unavoidable and urgent. So, who did it? The answers they received were different now. Less defensive, more careful. They spoke of alignment, of access, of silence, of how responsibility could be present without being singular. The question, repeated often enough, began to sound less like a demand and more like a habit, a reflex left over from stories that promised endings. This story had trained people out of that reflex. The confessor's words, once sharp with consequence, had softened into artifacts, studied rather than believed, contextualized rather than quoted. They were no longer dangerous. They were instructive. They showed how easily a system could be drawn toward resolution, how powerfully a single voice could reshape an entire inquiry, even when that voice failed to align with reality. In that way, the confession had finally found its place, not as an answer, but as evidence of how answers are constructed. The adjacent figure's presence had become almost abstract, their role discussed in frameworks and hypotheticals rather than biographies. They were no longer a person so much as a lesson about proximity, about how being near an act could matter even when hands remained clean. This abstraction was unsettling, but it endured because it reflected something true and difficult, that harm does not always announce itself with violence, and accountability does not always arrive wearing guilt. For the family, the long arc of the case reshaped time itself. The night in 1987 no longer stood alone as a rupture. It was one point in a continuum that included investigation, reopening, debate, restraint, and understanding. Grief did not resolve, but it changed texture, becoming less sharp, more enduring. They spoke less of justice and more of accuracy, less of answers and more of honesty. In doing so, they claimed something the case itself could not deliver: authorship of meaning. London remained the silent constant. The city that had swallowed the crime without noticing had also carried its echo without acknowledgement. It did not remember deliberately. It remembered structurally, in patterns of movement, in the way anonymity could both protect and endanger, in the quiet agreements people made with strangers every day. The case belonged to the city not because it was solved there, but because it made visible something the city had always known. By now, the cold case had become less about death than about restraint. About knowing when to stop digging, not because there was nothing left, but because what remained could not be extracted without distortion. That distinction mattered. It separated investigation from performance, truth from narrative, responsibility from blame. It was not a distinction easily taught. It had to be lived. And so the story reached its furthest extension, not forward, but outward, diffusing into practice, into language, into instinct. There would be no 16th revelation waiting in the wings, no final document that changed everything. The case had given what it could. What remained was vigilance, the quiet commitment to handle future truths with the care this one demanded. In the end, the cold case did not leave behind an answer. It left behind a standard, a way of approaching the unknown without forcing it to confess. A reminder that some mysteries are not failures of intelligence or effort, but reflections of complexity that must be respected. And in that respect, in that refusal to simplify what had proven resistant to simplicity, the case achieved something rare. It did not solve itself. It taught. By the 16th passage, the case had thinned into something almost intangible, a presence felt more than disgust. It no longer demanded attention. It commanded it, quietly, through absence. Those who returned to it did so not out of hope, but out of habit, the way one revisits a familiar street knowing nothing new will appear, yet sensing that something essential still lives there. The language around it had changed. People stopped calling it unresolved and began calling it incomplete, a subtle but important distinction. Unresolved implied failure. Incomplete implied honesty. It acknowledged effort without pretending to finish what could not be finished. The case existed now as a contour, a boundary line marking how far certainty could be pushed before it became fiction. In classrooms and closed briefings, it surfaced as a hypothetical stripped of names and dates. What do you do when evidence aligns but refuses to converge? When silence speaks louder than testimony? When time itself becomes an accomplice, erasing sharp edges and dulling urgency? There were no correct answers offered, only consequences mapped out carefully, each one heavier than the last. The investigators who had once carried the case into its reopening were older now, some retired, some gone. Those who remained spoke of it rarely, and when they did, it was not with regret. It was with respect. The case had demanded something most investigations never ask for, the willingness to stop short of triumph, to accept that doing less could be more truthful than doing everything. The family's relationship with the case had settled into something steady. It no longer defined their days, but it informed them, shaping how they understood loss, memory, and the long echo of unanswered questions. They had learned to live without waiting. Waiting had been the heaviest burden of all. Letting go of it did not erase the past. It reclaimed the present. The figures at the edges of a story had faded further into abstraction. Their lives, whatever shape they took, unfolded beyond the reach of the case, but not beyond its shadow. History had recorded their proximity. That record did not accuse. It remembered. And sometimes remembrance is the only verdict time allows. London continued to offer no commentary. The city had always been an expert in holding contradictions without resolution, in allowing stories to coexist without reconciliation. The case fit neatly into that tradition, another layer beneath the noise, another truth absorbed without acknowledgement. It was not marked by plaques or anniversaries. It was marked by understanding, passed quietly from one mind to another. What remained most striking was how little violence the story required to endure. The act itself had been brief. The aftermath had been long. Silence had done more work than force ever could. That realization lingered, unsettling and instructive, challenging the instinct to look for chaos where familiarity often hides the deepest harm. As the cold case settled into this final, attenuated form, it stopped behaving like a story at all. It became a lesson in proportion, in patience, in the ethics of knowing. It reminded those who encountered it that truth is not always something to be seized. Sometimes it is something to be approached slowly, acknowledged carefully, and left intact when further handling would only cause damage. There were no more parts to add in the way stories usually grow. No twists left that could reframe everything. Only a steady, enduring awareness that the night in 1987 had been understood as far as it could be without invention. That understanding, incomplete and unsatisfying, had proven enough to change how people listened, how they doubted, how they resisted easy endings. And so the case remained where it belonged, not closed, not open, but held. Held by memory, held by method, held by the quiet agreement that some truths do not need to be finished to be honored.